Hello, everyone. I'm Bill Roggio. I'm a senior fellow at Foundation for Defense of Democracies and editor of FDD's Long War Journal. And this is Generation Jihad. This is episode 59 of Generation Jihad. You'll probably note that Tom isn't leading the discussion here. Tom is taking a leave of absence. We hope that he'll be back shortly in the future, but in the meantime, we're going to soldier on. Tom, we miss you, we love you, and best of luck, Godspeed, and come home soon. Today, we have a special episode with a good friend of Generation Jihad. It's Craig Whiteside. Craig is an associate professor of national security affairs at the U.S. Naval War College. He's co-author of the ISIS Reader, which I highly recommend everyone give a read. It's a fantastic history and understanding of the Islamic State and its predecessor, al-Qaeda in Iraq and the Islamic State in Iraq. He's also a contributor to the Combating Terrorism Center's Sentinel, which I'm a big fan of as well. As soon as I learned of the death of the Islamic State's emir, I knew that I had to get Craig on the program to discuss this. Craig has been with us before. We did it episode 30. It was titled, I believe it was, the ISIS's new caliph was a snitch. It's one of my favorite episodes. And, so Craig, say hello.
Hi, Bill. I miss Tom as well. It's an honor to be back with you. Definitely not to miss podcast and series. And that was a memorable episode. Really enjoyed doing that with you.
Yeah, I can't reiterate this. As soon as I learned of his death, I even think I tweeted something out. I was like, you got to listen. Craig's the guy the go-to guy on this. We just had so much fun recording the previous episodes. And again, I just knew I had to have you back on to talk about, the death of Abu Ibrahim al-Hashimi al-Qurayshi. How do we want to refer to him? He has so many names, Craig. What do we want to call him today? It seems like everyone's going with al-Qurayshi. He goes by so many names, Haji Ibrahim, al-Mawali. What are we going to settle on today, Craig?
I use his al-Mawla normally, but it could be because we spent a lot of time, as you were talking about on that episode, doing the interrogation reports. It's part of his real name. Al-Mawla or Haji Abdullah is probably his most popular alias, but I mean, he has so many, as many of them do, and you know this more than most. There's even still conspiracies that he might not be the guy. The U.S. government is 100%, but they've been, as we've talked about maybe in previous podcast, the U.S. government's, might have been wrong before on the identity of Abu Umar and one of the first leader of the Islamic State of Iraq. But I'm pretty confident. So yeah, Haji Abdullah or al-Mawla works.
Let's go with Haji Abdullah. I think that's okay. That's probably one that we can all remember, right? Haji. We're gonna refer to Qurayshi as Haji Abdullah throughout the rest of the episode.
Yeah, because there's probably no more Qurayshis than Baghdadis now, so like we can't,
Right, exactly. And the whole thing with we don't want to get into that, right? So okay, so here let's get into it. So 2 days ago, in a daring early morning raid, U.S. Special Operations Forces killed Haji Abdullah at his hideout in the Syrian town of Atma in Idlib province. We'll get into the importance of the location of that raid in a moment. Before we do, let's talk about what happened during that raid. Craig, what do you know about how this raid was planned and executed over time, and how it came to be that we found him and he was killed during this raid?
I think a lot of this has been reported. I won't highlight much, except it looks like it's been a longer term. It's been a longer term operation than most people originally thought when it first happened. There was some ideas that it was related to the prison raid. Maybe the intelligence from that led back to, but that at least according to the White House, this has been long rehearsed by the Special Operations Force that conducted it. And there's possibilities that it's from some interrogations of pretty high-ranking Islamic State leaders that were captured in the last 6 months. That's typically how the others have been found over time. The only thing I'd add to some of the reporting is I think the government's doing a good job of shaping the narrative for once, in the sense that it took a very dangerous, long range, and as is the new buzzword, and over the horizon kind of capability from Iraq and neighboring territories, and into hostile territory, right, near the Turkish border, in order to capture the highest HVT that we probably have, and did it with extraordinary care to limit civilian casualties. The civilian casualties that happened, most, not all, were caused by the ISIL leader, Haji Abdullah himself, when he blew himself up, which is what his two predecessors did as well. So that was anticipated. But innocent civilians living in the same building were carefully and safely evacuated. So, and I see a lot of commentary right now, and this is the right way to avoid civilian casualties. But I think it's admirable. I think it was very high risk, right? If we lose a lot of very specially trained operators from a very finite, group of people to hostile fire when one of these goes bad, it's going to be really easy to say to take this high level of risk, but we won't do it again. And with that, I'll just end and say that, I'm just astounded still by the capability of our special operations forces, our military in general. It was a team effort, to be sure. I think everybody should step back and think about how difficult this was. They're making something that's excruciatingly difficult look really easy. And so my hats are off to the men and women, both in the armed forces, but also the IC that I'm sure helped put the pieces together to find this guy and to kill him.
Yeah, Craig, I echo those sentiments. The skill and the bravery of those troops and everyone involved in the IC that was able to plan and execute this attack. Our hats are off to you. Congratulations. I think the listeners of Generation Jihad and readers of the Long War Journal know that I've been very critical, and Tom as well, of the U.S. military. But this is really at a leadership level and more of at a high level. One thing I do know is our troops are very capable of conducting operations like this, or doing anything if they're given the resources and given the leeway to actually execute these operations and over the long haul. Counterinsurgency didn't fail because we were bad at fighting or bad at conducting actual counterinsurgency. It failed because we didn't have a commitment to doing it, and generals were not willing to stand up and oppose bad policy, things of that nature. So, there's two parts of this raid that, really, and I'm not being critical of this raid. You had mentioned one of them, which is the limiting civilian casualties. What they actually did, at least according to the reporting that I've read, the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal both have very good pieces. There's other, excellent articles about this raid, but they surrounded the building and for 45 minutes tried to get people to leave that building. This is a highly hostile environment. We don't know if the Islamic State's emir has security forces around him. We don't know. So our forces put themselves at great risk to try to limit civilian casualties, and yet civilian casualties still occurred during this operation. Some because he detonated his suicide bomb, but some because, some obviously occurred during the operation, very likely by U.S. forces. I want to be very clear that my position has always been that having zero casualties in any military operation, particularly in civilian areas, that's a pie in the sky dream. That number will never be zero. It will always have, it just will always be risky. And the other interesting thing is the timing, according to reporting, at least according to early reporting, that they planned, as you noted, Craig, they planned this over months. So they had to keep good eyes on him and ensure he wasn't going to escape before they would actually execute this operation. And there's a risk involved in that. And that risk would he escape? One article I read, I believe it was at the New York Times, mentioned that his driver was his courier. So we identified him, and that's all very interesting. But I'll leave it at that. If you have any further comments, Craig, please let me know.
Sure thing. Yeah, no, I think, I think the reporting, you got to be careful because some of it, people are going to all of a sudden start popping up with claims that they were part of, the intelligence to do that. And these are always self-serving. And then, within another week or two, there'll be, 5 different theories on the intelligence that led to this. And, we're still trying to figure out, how, previous leaders were killed. How exactly did they find Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, his predecessor? And, there's different theories on that. And, we'll eventually find out. But I think, we should always take a lot of the reporting that's going to come out in the next week or two with a grain of salt.
Yeah, absolutely, Craig. I agree. It's the fog of war, the first reports. Again, I want to be very clear. I'm going on what has been reporting. If that's true, it's interesting. We'll ultimately, I believe, we'll find out the truth. And, it is interesting if this reporting is true, how quickly the White House is willing to release details like this. I always am a little uncomfortable when we see such detailed reporting. I was uncomfortable with this with the Bin Laden raid and this raid in particular. It's just, it's nice to know, and it feels good to know, or at least think but it gets a little too close to operational reporting.
It's the voyeur in all of us. We want to know. There's the two most interesting clips that I saw were, kind of, one was a Twitter thread, the other was an interview. The interview was Brett McGurk, and he did mention that. A lot of information was found on the site. So, that confirms that there's going to be either follow-on raids or the possibility of follow-on raids, but also the exploitation of this network. And these are huge finds. We saw the same thing after Abu Umar and Abu Hamza were killed in 2010. It led to just a huge cascade of roll-ups across. And I think you reported on all of those back in 2010 and in the Long War Journal. And so that's likely to come. So I thought that was really interesting that he'd come out and say it the day of, like, hey, we found a treasure trove of stuff. But of course, the Islamic State probably knows that. Like, they probably are the first to know that. That said, how quickly they are to change their security procedures is probably a battle to them. But that people make mistakes in these kind of situations. The other one was, I think it was Bellingcat was looking at confirming. Looking at different open source imagery and, on the ground reporting and pictures and videos that were taken that largely confirmed the U.S. government's depiction of what happened, that al-Mawla had set off his, Haji Abdullah had set off what was probably either an IED in his apartment or a vest that he wore on himself, which is again what his 2 predecessors did, and created a large explosion that actually. And they could kind of, they made an argument that was somewhat convincing that it looked like, it wasn't a JDAM. It was an explosion that happened inside the apartment and the blood spatter and all this other stuff. So those are the 2 things I thought were most interesting of the commentary that you mentioned in the articles.
Yeah, and Craig, on the JDAM issue, right? If the U.S. was going to drop a JDAM, and if I recall, the New York Times article that talks about how they surrounded the house, they went and actually interviewed 5 families, neighboring families. So that part didn't come from intelligence. I give it a high degree of confidence that that's true. Why would you take the risk of surrounding a house for 45 minutes and then you want to exploit the intelligence? You want to capture Haji Abdullah, and then you drop a JDAM on it. It doesn't make sense. Interesting. I'll have to check out that Bellingcat thread. That's very interesting. I hadn't seen that. So thank you for pointing me to that. I appreciate that.
Right on.
So, let's talk about where he was killed, which was just miles from where his predecessor, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, was killed. What's the significance of this location for the Islamic State? Do you know who administers this area? And what could this tell us about a possible handshake deal between the Islamic State and other jihadist groups operating in the area?
Yeah, those are some really good questions. I've seen a lot of people on both sides of this argument is HTS and the Islamic State in some kind of, at least some kind of deal with the top leadership. Pretty hard feelings on both sides, pretty strong feelings on both sides on the possibilities of that. This is HTS's area, but the question is how well are they administering it and securing it? There's lots of reports that the whole entire area is refugees, so that no one knows each other. There's no one moving into a neighborhood like my neighborhood where exactly who the new person is, and you go and find out where are they from, and how long are they going to be here. That's just not happening in this area. But I'll start with, there's nothing impossible in these areas. It reminds me of Abu Ali al-Ambari, who's a former deputy to the Caliph back in 2014 to 16. Very, very high visible leader throughout the entire movement. We've talked about him a lot. He admitted in his interrogation that the Iranians had supplied his network, his Northern AQI network, against U.S. and coalition Iraqi forces. And it's still hard for me to believe. I still sit there and think sometimes, it's just incredibly bizarre to believe that the Iranians were doing this, but it's also hard to understand why he would lie about it in an interrogation. And it can almost make sense. So,
Craig, may I interject it really?
Yeah,
quickly?
Of course. I know you have strong feelings on this, but please do.
Yeah. So I recently testified in a case. It's called Cabrera versus Iran. It's the U.S. families of U.S. soldiers killed or U.S. soldiers who were wounded in Afghanistan, or civilians who were kidnapped or wounded or killed and attacked. They're sued Iran for supporting the Taliban. And I've always known that Iran has supplied support for the Taliban. We've seen it in press reporting here and there. But when I went into the case, my thoughts on it were, and I'd done some research on it, but never a deep dive. And I did, when I started researching this, I really started seeing, and we got intelligence reports declassified, went through just reams of information. We tracked Iranian support of the Taliban all the way to the heart of Kabul, to what they called the Kabul Attack Network, which was the alliance of al-Qaeda, the Taliban, of course, with the Haqqanis, Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan, various groups. Iranian support, now, I won't say it rivaled Pakistan's support. It was definitely secondary to Pakistan's support. I always would have described it as tertiary before they started that case. And then after I was done testifying in that case and writing the report, I was convinced the Iranians play a very clever game. It's not surprising to me. They support the enemies of their enemies when it's, and then we go back to that secret deal between Iran and al-Qaeda. I didn't mean to make this all about Iran and this, but it's a very key point, right? We sit here and we go, how could Iran support these groups that are diametrically opposed to it?
Right.
And the answer is Iraqis. Yeah, right. And the answer is because they play a different level of chess. We're playing
a much more strategic game.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So I start that again, like you said, I'll caveat as well, as not to inject the Iranians into this, but just to say that, a lot of times I'll read these things and they're really hard to believe. That said, I don't think they're colluding for a variety of reasons. Both. It's hugely ironic, and it might say a lot about the state of the Islamic State today, where they're at in their ability to hide their leaders. But they chose a hostile rivals territory. Certainly, it was probably the lesser of all evils, right? You don't want to be in the regime areas. You don't want to be in the SDF areas. Iraq is usually where the leadership has hit out quite successfully, right? I mean, Omar and Abu Hamza last from 2006 to 2010 in the center of Iraq. So I'm not sure if it's the role, the PMFs who are not playing a productive role, but certainly have a lot more freedom of maneuver than they did in 2010 across Sunni areas of Iraq. I don't know if that's making it untenable, but the leadership has decided not to be in Iraq, which I thought would be safer. And they're sitting close to the Turkish border. It could allow a quick, easy escape to a place that would be untouchable to us. Deter incursions. We have to be very careful about even going near that border because of the Turkish influence in that area. But I think, do I think they have a deal with HTS? stranger things have happened, but I think no, right? I think Giuliani, if he had a chance to take out the ISIL leadership after what they did to him in 2013, tried to pull the rug out from him, ran a second track, frustrated his efforts to kind of take ownership and control of the Syrian jihad against the regime, crippled him for quite some time. And maybe even forced him to do the kind of really radical political, adventures and that he's doing now. They're each other's mortal threat in a way that the U.S. isn't to this particular group or Syria or Iraq. And only one of them is going to get to lead the Salafi political milieu. And so, it's even though these groups do collaborate and cooperate when it's beneficial to both, and I think they all do it to some degree, regardless of sectarian or even sometimes ideology, at the end of the day, they're too similar to allow each other at this point to coexist. So there's, one of them is going to be the leader of the movement at the end, and the other is not going to exist. And so, I think in this case, it was one of those areas that area is probably just not administered and secured like we think it is.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent analysis, Craig. I tend to agree with that. I wouldn't, like you said, I wouldn't be shocked if there was some type of nod and a wink, look the other way deal. Maybe it came from lower level sympathy, but at the end of the day, I don't think this comes from a strategic agreement between Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and the Islamic State. So Craig, let's talk about the succession for a little bit. Do you have any ideas who may, I realize this is a difficult question. I've thought about this, and, you're the only person I could think that could provide it. Who do we think that can replace Haji Abdullah at this point in time?
I don't know. Haji Abdullah was actually the strong horse to take Abu Bakr's. It was pretty well. He was one of a few candidates, but it was. I think he was the front runner and had been groomed for some time, especially during when the caliphate was strong and conventional and securing territory, and he was, high level, but that's an after effect of some of the major leaders being killed by the United States and its coalition partners like Abu Ali al-Anbari or Abu Muslim al-Turkmani. Some of the really high profile leaders who were leading the Islamic State back in 2006, before it was the Islamic State, right? I mean, they were leading Al Qaeda in Iraq for the most part as the highest ranking Iraqis in the group. So all those guys are gone and left the vacuum for Haji Abdullah, but it's not clear who that is. I know they have a succession plan. I don't know that, but I'm very confident that they have a succession plan. It's something we can find in their writing and their doctrine. So, for example, in the ISIS Reader, we have the Fallujah Memorandum of 2009. It says, look, we have to have foolproof, already set in place leadership succession plans, because without it, we'll fail. Without it, this movement will break apart. And we've worked way too hard to kind of gel the Salafi movement, Salafi jihadists, even just Sunni Iraqis in general, and recruited them into the fold. And we're not going to blow that by not having a pre-established plan. I don't think it's locked in. I'm sure So they usually have a plan, but right now, I mean, the easiest way or the best way I could put it is their bench is very thin.
Yes, so as you mentioned, the first generation leaders, the old heads are gone. The hardest thing I think to do in this job, or one of the hardest things, is to identify that next generation of leadership. I'm sure they're out there, but they're not very visible to us, and we don't know how effective they are. And that's just the reality. I agree with you. I thought about this for a little bit yesterday, a little bit this morning, racked my brain and said, well, I don't think I could identify who that person is. It'll be interesting. I suspect, as you said, the Islamic State has gone through this analysis. They have to, as you mentioned. I'm going to take a moment here to pause. This is Generation Jihad. I'm your host, Bill Roggio, and we're speaking to Craig Whiteside. We're discussing the death of the Emir of the Islamic State. That's Haji Abdullah. So, Craig, you mentioned the succession process. What does this look like? How long does the Islamic State take to appoint a new leader? How do they meet? How do they pick that next leader? Tell us what you know from your research.
I mean, they've a very well established pattern, largely, from practice, from doing it. They've had plenty of practice, as we understand, very capable counterterrorism pressure they've been under by the United States. So, these are all, I don't know this for a fact, but I'm pretty sure, Haji Abdullah has some guidance, either written or verbal, probably written to make sure no one, hijacks any of it, but guidance for the delegated committee, which is probably dispersed. That's the committee of senior leaders who runs day-to-day operations, but also to the consultative council, right? The Shura Council, the senior leaders from across the organization, regardless of where they are, in the leadership. But people who, and largely religious, who will vote on the best candidate according to their doctrine, and this is written doctrine. This goes back to 2006 and informing the people about the Islamic State before it was established. The person to lead the movement had to have religious credentials, and it's something that, like, the founder Abu Musab al-Zarqawi didn't have. Right? He tried his best to sound religious, but it never had any actual formal instruction whatsoever. So they have to have religious credentials and have experience as an imam, as well as knowledge of jurisprudence, experience in the organization as a judge and shari, an advisor to leaders. So the governor, they would be a wali's advisor on religious matters and the proclamations that the governor would do. They have to have a Quraysh tie. So Mawla had both the Hashimi and Qurayshi ties, as you mentioned, at the beginning of the broadcast, as part of his name, and all of them have Abu Umar al-Baghdadi, the first leader, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, and then al-Mawla, all had a well-researched, pre-researched tie to Muhammad's tribe, and even in some cases, like in Mawla's case, the sub-tribe that Muhammad actually belonged to, the Hashimi. So assuming that we're correct, that this is the leader of the Islamic State, and like I said, the U.S. government is absolutely 100% certain. But we've had some confusions, and they've tried to put us off the scent in the past. But if he is, we'll very quickly see a martyrdom announcement. They won't hide it. They'll announce a new emir within the next 2 weeks, to be sure. Again, assuming that he's the correct guy. And then the tricky part is then in something that they did practice last time when Abu Bakr was killed 2 years ago, but hadn't really had to worry about it before. And that's getting that outlying wilayah, the provinces, to pledge to the new leader. Abu Bakr did something. I think the most important thing Abu Bakr did in his entire tenure was not announce the caliphate in 2014, which I think was almost like it was pretty obvious what was happening, right? It was very symbolic, right? But what Abu Bakr did near the end of his tenure was to make sure that people, all of the provinces from West Africa all the way to East Asia, repledged their allegiance to him after the caliphate had failed. And that was a reminder that he was still the legitimate leader, even though they didn't control territory, which is a very important point. And it could have gone another way. People might have been like, "Oh, you guys lost territory. That's it. We're free to go on our own." Now, there's reasons they wouldn't do that. I won't really get into them here, but he set the next and then he gets killed. Then he gets killed, and he has just magically either had the intuition, or it's part of this idea of leadership succession that they said, "Look, we got to make sure that things are set up in case something bad happens." And then he gets killed, and the next guy. What do we see? 100% of the provinces all pledged to Haji Abdullah as the new leader, as the new caliph, even. And so these are the things to watch for in the coming weeks.
Yeah, that's a great point. His ability to keep the Islamic State together after the loss of their physical caliphate in Iraq and Syria. That was a feat. I think it's widely misunderstood. This is why, look, Tom and I'm sure you agree, there's an ebb and flow to the jihad. And right now, the Islamic State is in an ebb, right? They've lost the territory in Iraq and Syria, but there's a flow in certain theaters, and particularly in West Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa and Central Africa, where the Islamic State has some success. If the Islamic State isn't able to name a new caliph and get the pledges of allegiance, the bayat from the provinces, then, we can look at this and say this raid to kill Haji Abdullah was a major success. So yeah, let's get into that a little bit. What does the loss of Haji Abdullah mean for the Islamic State? Do you look at this as a strategic defeat or just a tactical blow that the Islamic State has to weather, and something it will have to deal with the problems of succession and getting the provinces swearing allegiance to it?
Yeah, I think it can be confusing, but this is the type of stuff we teach military officers in their professional military education, like I do at for the Naval War College here at the Naval Postgraduate School. But our leadership decapitation is a tactic, right? It is clearly a tactic, but tactics can have strategic effects, and that's what gets confusing. So if this breaks up the caliphate, as you're saying, if the provinces are like we just did 2 years under a guy we never heard of or saw his face and aren't really even sure who he is other than Abu Ibrahim, al-Hashimi, al-Qurayshi, according to you're telling us this, and we trust you, but we just did 2 years under this guy and never heard his name, and now you're going to give us another guy like that? That is... And it's funny because I started thinking, let me rank the leadership succession crises that this group has had. Like Zarqawi dies, and that's actually a good thing for the organization moving forward because they needed to be more Iraqi. The group is 95% Iraqi, and their Iraqi rivals were like, come on, we can't have this guy leading us forever. He's a rock star, but he's also, a little unstable. Abu Omar and Abu Hamza are running it together. And when they get killed, the intel trove and the cascading effects from that almost take the organization down. Like I said, as you've written about. So there's this, and Abu Bakr, who's a nobody, shows up and he's quiet for 2 years, and just like this pattern, and he survives that. But it also, corresponds. He's kind of helped with kind of the upswing, the geopolitical events that are going on, Syria, foreign fighter flows, a lot of different things are helping him kind of claw back into it and then become like this, guy who's anointed the first caliph. So that was pretty difficult too, but I think this is their worst one. I think because I was saying that, now that they've gone global, their inability to keep somebody alive long enough to kind of lead the resurgence that they're going to need to do to kind of hold this together is, I'm not saying they won't come out of this okay. I'm not saying that some of the advantages that they've had as a global caliphate, at least according, in relation to their rival, won't still hold strong for them. But, if we saw some defections, I would not be surprised. Or people making claims to be the next leader from a different, outlying province like West Africa, which is, it doesn't have much activity going on, but they might be more successful in controlling territory than the core in Iraqi Syria. So.
Yeah, the succession, I think that's the key here. We watch how that goes and we watch how the provinces deal with it. The one thing I think is misunderstood here is that just because let's say that his death and a failure to properly handle succession leads a breakup to the Islamic State. These groups, these provinces will go elsewhere. Does it mean they rejoin al-Qaeda? Do they just create local branches? So the jihadism won't go away. It'll just be absorbed or repurposed to other tasks. But the breakup of the Islamic State itself, I would say it would still be a strategic defeat because of the organization of its media, particularly its media operations, which I think are just its most effective, one of the most effective part of the organization. So it's excellent analysis. Thank you for that, Craig. Did you have any other comments on that or?
No. I think, Yeah, I mean, the commentary tends to be, and this is typical of the leadership decapitation kind of genre, and the writing that's gone into it is kind of narrows into this tactic, and then they're like, but they always replace the leader, so therefore this doesn't work. Like, well, it's hard to measure how much harder it is for the caliph to hold this stuff together, and this leadership, they overcome leadership decapitation until they don't, right? Until they don't.
I had a conversation with a friend the other day, and we were using the movement of the Taliban in Pakistan as an example of this. I think one of the biggest blows to the movement of the Taliban in Pakistan is when the U.S. killed Haki Mullah Masood. I think that was in 2013. This is when the U.S. drone campaign was also targeting top al-Qaeda leaders in Pakistan. And I'll note that did not cause it hurt the group without a doubt, but it did not cause the collapse. We were killing them pretty quickly, but we weren't killing them quickly enough. But with the movement of Taliban in Pakistan, the removal of Haki Mullah Masood, they've replaced him with Mullah Fazullah, who was the wrong clan. He was a divisive leader. He looked crazy. I mean, this is a guy whose nickname was Mullah Radio, and whose big thing was anti-polio campaigns. And then Taliban leaders' children start dying of polio because they said it with polio vaccines was a Western plot. The TTP breaks up. It splinters. No, but the group was still had deadly elements, but it wasn't as organized. Then here's the example of a decapitation strike that was a failure. We killed him, I think in 18 or 19. I don't remember. The years are just getting past me, Craig. We should have left him. He was divisive. The TTP was disorganized. Its violence was low. He's been replaced with an effective leader who's reorganized the group. He was from the right clan. He's well-respected religious leader, had all the right credentials. And the TTP, the movement of the Taliban in Pakistan's insurgency, has reorganized. So sometimes I think it's just to me, though, that's the perfect instance. Like Haki Mullah, his predecessor, Baytullah Masood, was very effective. Haki Mullah was just as effective. His successor was ineffective. It led to the breakup of the group, but the group was able to stick around. Those elements were able to stick around long enough. They also had the advantage of the Afghan Taliban and al-Qaeda and other groups in there, sort of kind of keeping it all together, even when it was apart. But I just always find this conversation of decapitation strikes, is it a tactic? Our leadership when I'm talking about our political leadership, and Republican and Democrat, have viewed it as a strict strategy, when at all times it has been a tactic. And it's refreshing to hear you say that.
Yeah, I mean, it could be because, the special mission units that are strategic assets. So then, but because you use a strategic asset in a tactical manner doesn't make it a strategic, impact, but it can have strategic impact. You're just not sure. And I think you have a great point that my partner, Aurora Ingram, and I've brought up a couple of times, is like, when do you refrain from doing leader decapitation? Because that leader is tearing that organization apart, or he's bringing it down, or he has the wrong vision. They picked the wrong guy. Just like you're saying, I think the Islamic State's done that in the past, and we've done them a favor by, but the problem is, from a theoretical perspective, that makes total sense. But, operators and policymakers, once they find out where X leader is, and they're important enough to accept the risk involved in that operation, they're going to do it. I mean, they're just going to do it. And the problem is, if you get a better leader that's able to reorganize or invigorize the movement, and that's very difficult to know, right? Shaping the bench is what it's called, but you don't, do you have the fidelity of information to make those kind of decisions? And no politician is going to take the risk that people find out that they knew Osama bin Laden was in X cave and didn't do anything about it. I mean, look at what happened to George W. Bush, with the Tora Bora stuff. Like we still hear about that.
Yeah, I think that is. I wish I could have run that operation. I wish I had. I just nothing would have walked out, Craig, and that would have. I think we would have had a very, very different war.
You needed the Moab back in 2002. Yeah.
I literally would have surrounded the area, issued an ultimatum: walk out or nothing walks out. And then daisy chain pattern of saturation. and shrug my shoulders. I mean, we've never had that. Well, that's a whole different discussion for a whole nother day, but we failed to have that commitment. War is ugly, and it should be ugly, but it also should be brief, and you should defeat your enemies. And we let our enemies stay in the game, and Al-Qaeda was able to reconstitute, reorganize, and then from it spawns the Islamic State. Now it has a footprint throughout the globe when it was pretty limited pre 9/11. So, well, I think this is a good place to wrap it up, Craig. Tell us what you're working on. Any interesting projects? What do you got coming up in the future?
Cool. Yeah. I'm still doing some work on the leadership succession, trying to understand the theory behind, what gives a leader legitimacy in these militant groups, the Zawar, like you mentioned. And you mentioned this before we came on. You were talking about Zawahiri and, how do we know, what is it that, what's his relationship to his followers, charismatic versus kind of these legitimate or these legal, rational kind of, I think that's something the Islamic State's done well. So I'm working on that with Haruro. And then with another partner, I'm looking back at an old meeting back in the good old days of 2006, I think, when you were stomping around Fallujah. There's a big meeting of the Mujahideen Shura Council, and we have records of this meeting, but not what was discussed. And we're trying to understand what was discussed. We think this meeting of the Mujahideen Shura Council back in 2006 is planning the long-term future of the Islamic State. And all of them go on to lead the Islamic State later on in 2013 to 16. So there's just this coincidence that's hard to understand how, in the randomness of, counterterrorism pressures and taking people off the battlefield, like how is it that the same group of guys who are, planning the future of the Islamic State are running it in 2013 to 16? It must have seemed fantastical to them, but we're trying to understand, like, what are they doing in this one meeting? So it's kind of unusual to have this level of fidelity of a group of guys meeting together, knowing who they were, guessing what they were talking about, i.e., what do we do with this Zarqawi guy who's been a boon to us, but like he's going to get found here soon. What do we do? And that kind of leads us to where we are today.
Yep. If we only had a JDAM for that meeting, right? Craig, that's extremely fascinating, and let's keep in touch. When you publish on both issues, we'll have you on. Also, I'd like to get, once the Islamic State announces its new leader, I'd love to get you back on. I mean, that's probably in a week or two, but if you're willing, come back on. Let's discuss it. Let's see what we know about the new leader and see how this has resonated throughout the Islamic State. Sound like a deal?
That sounds great. And I'll tell you one thing I forgot to mention, and I would love to, this is a total wild hunt, but the group is known for being very Iraqi. Be very interesting to see if now that they've gone global and had two Iraqi leaders as global leaders, do they find someone who's certainly going to be from the region, because they have to have those ties that I talked about, the Quraysh tie, but be interesting to see if it's a Saudi or a Jordanian or an Egyptian that has these particular ties. Not too hard to have this particular tie, as long as it's well documented. So that's something to look forward to, but we'll see. That's what I'm looking for.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Fascinating. Let's see how this shakes out, Craig. I really appreciate you coming on in such short notice, and appreciate the fascinating conversation.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Big fan of the podcast. Never missed it. Definitely have always enjoyed your work, all the way back, and definitely missed Tom. So to give him my best. I heard he's got a book coming out soon. I'm really excited for it.
Yes, we are as well. I'll certainly let him know. I'm sure he's listening. Thank you, Craig, for everything. You are too kind, sir. You have a great day. Thanks, everyone, for joining us for today's episode 59 of Generation Jihad. Just a reminder, you could find us on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you listen to podcasts. Make sure you subscribe and leave us a review. Thanks again, and we'll see you again soon.